The frost bit deeper than any blade, the night wrapping itself tight around the campfire's dying glow. The cowboy, boots heavy with snow, glanced down at the cold ground. His only defense against the creeping freeze was a trick passed down from years of living hard on the frontier. Before we ride into this, let us know where you're watching from, and if tales of frontier survival stir something inside you, tip your hat and subscribe for tomorrow's story. The wind howled across the plains, bitter and relentless. It tore through the empty landscape, howling through the bare trees, rattling the windows of the small cabin where the cowboy sat. Outside, the snow had been falling for hours, already piling in thick drifts, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, typical for this part of the frontier, but no less punishing. It wasn't the kind of cold you could ignore. It was the kind that demanded respect, the kind that could take a man's life if he wasn't careful. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, sending small bursts of heat into the otherwise cold room. But even the fire couldn't hold back the bite of the night. The cowboy shifted in his seat, his body stiff and aching from a long day's ride. His boots, worn and cracked from years of hard use, sat near the fire, drying out from the day's wet snow. But they weren't warming up fast enough. He could feel the cold creeping in, moving up from his toes through the leather. The cowboy adjusted the wool blanket around his shoulders, but it didn't stop the chill in his feet. His boots had seen better days, but they'd always kept him warm enough. Until now. Now, the leather felt like a second skin, thin and cracked, offering no protection against the relentless cold. He could feel the frost beginning to nibble at his toes, an all-too-familiar sensation. If he didn't do something soon, it would be the start of a long, cold night. The fire wasn't enough. It never was. He'd learned that lesson too many times. A fire could be snuffed out in an instant if the wind changed direction, and when the temperature dropped this low, warmth wasn't something you could take for granted. The cowboy knew survival here wasn't just about having a good fire, it was about having the right tools and the right knowledge. And right now, his boots weren't going to get him through the night without help. That's when the old memory hit him, something an old cowhand had taught him years ago. A simple trick, passed down from men who'd spent winters in places far colder than this. The cowboy's lips tugged into a faint smile as he remembered. It wasn't fancy, just a basic method to keep boots from freezing overnight. No tools, no fancy equipment, just ashes. The same ashes from the fire, carefully packed inside his boots to trap what little warmth was left. He reached into the embers of the fire, pulling out a small pot and carefully scraping a handful of hot ash into it. His fingers moved with practiced ease, as though he'd done this 100 times before. The trick wasn't new, but it was effective. It had kept him alive before, and it would again. He could feel the heat from the ash already beginning to soak into the leather. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cowboy placed his boots near the fire again, knowing that tonight he'd survive. The night stretched on, cold and unrelenting, as the cowboy settled back against the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. His boots, now packed with ashes, sat close to the fire, warming slowly. The faint glow from the flames flickered on the wood-paneled walls, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the storm raged, howling through the trees, its icy fingers tugging at the cabin's frail defenses. But inside, the cowboy was at peace, for the moment at least. He'd learned long ago that in the wilderness, peace didn't come easy. Survival was a matter of small things, little tricks, and hard-won knowledge that made all the difference. Most folks didn't understand that. They rushed, they cut corners, and they paid the price. But out here, on the edge of civilization, you couldn't afford to make mistakes. The cowboy knew the trick wouldn't keep his boots warm all night, but it was enough to get him through until morning. As the fire crackled, he leaned forward and pulled his boots closer to the heat, careful not to get too close. Too much heat could undo the work of the ash. He needed just enough warmth to stop the frost from taking root in his leather. He settled back into his chair, a rough seat made from an old stump, and pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. His hands, calloused and weathered, reached for the old tin cup by his side, still half full with coffee from earlier in the evening. The warmth of the cup was a small comfort, something to cling to while the cold pressed in on every side. He took a sip, savoring the warmth, the bitter taste a reminder of the long road that had brought him here. The wind outside howled louder, sending the snow swirling against the cabin's small windows. It was a sound he knew well, a sound that spoke of isolation, of the land claiming everything it touched. The cowboy had heard that sound many times before. It was a song of the wilderness, and it never lost its power to chill the bones. But tonight, it wasn't as threatening as it had been before. He knew what to do. He knew how to survive. His boots, now warm to the touch, felt like a small victory. It wasn't much, but it was a victory nonetheless. When you lived on the edge, you took whatever victories you could find. The cowboy had made a habit of that. Life didn't hand you much out here. The land didn't care if you had plans, if you had dreams. It only cared if you could survive another day. He thought of the old cowhand's words, "Keep yourself warm, keep your feet dry, and you'll see another sunrise." Simple advice, but advice that had saved him more than once. The cowboy smiled to himself as he settled deeper into his chair. The warmth from the fire and the ashes in his boots was enough. Tonight, he would make it. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and let the sound of the storm become background noise. In the morning he would write again, but for now he had a few hours of peace, something he rarely found out here, and that too was enough. The fire had dwindled to a low, steady burn by the time the cowboy stirred from his chair. The warmth of the embers spread through the cabin like a blanket, but the night still held its grip on the land outside. He glanced at his boots. The trick had worked. The ashes inside had trapped the heat, just as the old cowhand had promised. His toes weren't numb anymore, and the biting cold no longer gnawed at his feet. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep him from freezing before morning. He flexed his toes inside his boots, testing them. The sensation of warmth, however small, was a luxury out here in the wilderness. He hadn't realized how much he took for granted until the cold came. The frontier had a way of reminding you just how fragile life could be. One wrong step, one careless mistake, and it was over. The cowboy had seen it happen to others, men who had underestimated the land, thought they knew better, or simply got unlucky. Out here, luck was something you couldn't rely on. You had to make your own. With a quiet sigh, he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and let his eyes wander across the cabin. There wasn't much to it, just the essentials. A sturdy table, a few chairs, a long shelf filled with cans and dried goods. The simple comforts of a man who had learned long ago that excess wasn't necessary for survival. He'd learned to live light, to take what the land gave him and make do. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And out here, reality was all that mattered. Outside, the wind continued to howl, a constant reminder of the land's power. But the cowboy knew he wasn't entirely at its mercy. He had his tricks, his knowledge, and tonight his boots were going to keep him alive. That small victory felt like a win against the wild, against the forces that sought to claim him. The hours passed in silence, the storm continuing its assault on the cabin's walls. The cowboy sat still, his mind wandering, thinking of the days ahead. The ride would be long, and the cold would never truly leave him, not in these mountains. But the trick with the ashes had bought him time, and sometimes that was all you could ask for. As the fire crackled and popped, the cowboy thought of other winters, long, bitter stretches of time when survival wasn't guaranteed. He had been lucky then, just as he was lucky now. But luck didn't always last. He knew that better than anyone. The land didn't care for luck. It only cared for strength, for patience, and for those who understood it. Tonight, the cowboy would sleep. He would rest his weary eyes, knowing that the ash trick had done its job, that he'd made it through another night in the wilderness. But tomorrow would come with its own challenges, its own cold, and the cowboy would face them as he always had, one step at a time, one decision at a time. With the fire now reduced to a soft glow, the cowboy leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the wind outside. He knew the land, the cold, and the wilderness would always be there. But for tonight, it could wait. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the snowy plains outside the cabin. The storm had passed, but its aftermath remained. The cowboy stirred from his sleep, his body stiff from the cold, but the warmth in his boots had held through the night. The ashes had done their job. His toes, though not entirely warm, weren't frozen either, and that was something to be thankful for. He pulled himself from the blanket, the chill in the air wrapping around him like a second skin. His breath came out in clouds, disappearing into the stillness of the room. It was always like this in the mornings after a storm. Everything felt quieter, somehow more sacred. The world outside, covered in fresh snow, seemed untouched, waiting for the day to begin. The cowboy flexed his fingers, rubbing them together to shake off the lingering cold. He moved toward the stove, stoking the fire one last time and adding a few more logs to bring the warmth back to the cabin. The crackling sound filled the space, the flames licking the air and pushing away the damp morning chill. He set a kettle of water on the stove, knowing the day ahead would be just as cold, but at least he had the tools to handle it. With his boots still near the fire, he pulled his coat tight around his shoulders and stepped toward the door. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind still swept across the prairie with a raw intensity. The cowboy glanced back at the cabin, taking in the simple life he had built here. There was no luxury, no easy living, but that wasn't why he had come. He had come for survival, for solitude, and for the peace that came with knowing the land and knowing himself. He opened the door and stepped into the crisp morning air. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he looked out over the vast expanse before him. The storm had painted the world in a soft white blanket, and everything felt new, fresh. The landscape had been reshaped overnight, as if the earth itself had been given a second chance. But beneath the beauty, the cold still lingered, and the cowboy knew that it wasn't over yet. The wind cut through him immediately, biting at his skin, but his boots, the same boots he had fought so hard to keep warm, now felt solid beneath him. He flexed his feet, feeling the weight of the ashes that had kept the cold at bay. The warmth was still there, a small but significant victory against the wilderness. He hadn't just survived the night, he had outwitted the cold. It was a reminder that survival in these parts was more than just a fight against nature. It was a battle of wits, of knowing when to act and when to wait. The cowboy pulled his scarf tight around his neck and headed toward his horse, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the frost-covered ground. The day awaited, and though the road would be long, he knew one thing for certain: with every step, he would be ready. The cowboy swung into the saddle with practiced ease, the creak of his worn leather reins filling the quiet morning. The snow crunched beneath his horse's hooves as he nudged the animal forward, the chill of the air biting at his face. The storm had passed, but the land still held its grip, and the cowboy knew the journey ahead would be long and unforgiving. The mountains stretched out before him, covered in a thick blanket of snow, the peaks sharp and unforgiving against the pale sky. He adjusted his coat, pulling it tighter around his body as the wind picked up. The cold seeped through his wool layers, but he was used to it now. The ashes in his boots had worked their magic, but it was the land itself that would decide if he made it through another day. Out here, there was no room for complacency, no second chances. Every step, every move had to be calculated. The cowboy glanced back over his shoulder at the cabin he had left behind, its small silhouette fading into the distance. It had been a simple place, but it had kept him safe through the worst the wilderness could throw at him. In a way, it had been more than just a shelter. It had been a reminder of what mattered most: survival, and the knowledge that no matter how harsh the world outside, you could always fight back. As he rode, the wind howled across the plains, the sound a constant companion. The snow had stopped, but the air remained heavy with the scent of winter. It was a smell the cowboy knew well, a mixture of frost, ice, and the smell of distant pines. He let the horse pick its way through the snow, each hoof step a soft crunch in the otherwise still world. The silence was broken only by the occasional caw of a raven or the distant howl of a coyote. He adjusted his grip on the reins, the leather warm in his hands despite the cold. The horse beneath him moved with a steady rhythm, the animal accustomed to the hardships of the frontier. Together, they made a good pair, both seasoned, both worn down by the years, but neither giving up. The cowboy had learned long ago that the key to survival wasn't just about knowing how to ride it, was about knowing how to endure. The snow-covered land stretched out before him, vast and empty, but in that emptiness, the cowboy felt something he couldn't quite name. It was a quiet understanding, a peace that came only with the harshest of trials. Out here, there was no need for words, no need for companionship. It was just him, his horse, and the land. And in that, there was a strange sort of comfort. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow. The cowboy didn't look back. He had no reason to. The path ahead was clear, and he knew that with each mile he was one step closer to where he needed to be. There was always more to be done, more to survive, but for now the ride was enough.